All right, let's see here. All right, so I was talking about opacity maps. Now we have, of course, similar settings that you already are used to in KeyShot 2, and that's
Muted.
basically your scale.
Unmuted.
Okay. All right, and some problems with audio now. All right, I think I'm back now. So let us know, and Brian is here to let me know if there's still problems. All right, we'll show my screen. All right. I think we're back. So, and again, let us know if you're still having problems. All right, opacity maps. They basically, of course, the idea here, we're mapping the transparency on the surface. So you can see we're able to cut holes basically through any material type. So I can switch this actually over to a diffuse material, and those holes are maintained, as you can see. I can continue to change color, and then I can also add in other textures in addition to that transparency or opacity map. So, for example, I can bring in a bump map as well to give it a little bit of the feel of a little bit of depth. So let's bring in some bump map here. Now, the textures that we ship with KeyShot, they have usually an alpha and a bump and possibly a color texture to go along with it. So in this case, I'm going to bring in this normal map to act as my bump map. Now, basically, for those of you that aren't familiar with normal maps, so they're a special type of image that have actual 3D information in them. The RGB values of the image actually distort the surface. The surface is what we call normals based in XYZ. So RGB equates to basically XYZ. And in order to make a normal map work properly, you have to go in your texture tab, enable normal map. All right. So now we can sync up these textures, and we can just set those to the box and scale those down. So now if we compare, let's take a look. You can see that the little highlights we're catching on this surface. If I turn off the bump, there's a big difference between having that on and off. And of course, I can go in and adjust my bump height to get a more subtle or less subtle effect with that bump. And I can go in and also add a color texture. So we can go in here, if I wanted to add this over the entire surface, I can do that, scale that down. There we go. So you can create some very interesting effects. Now, one of the parts of the interface that has changed in regards to textures is when you look at your Properties tab, you actually see references to your textures being made. Because it now is trying to show you that you've mapped your color, and this is basically overriding the color. Let me turn this off here. This is overriding this color setting. I can have this set to red, like a very bright red, but if I have my texture enabled, I'm not using that bright red anymore. I'm using this texture for my color. So back in KeyShot 2, this would still show as that red color, and I'd be changing that, and it wouldn't do anything. So this tells you your texture is your color now. However, you can expand your color, and you see I'm using this, this marble pattern texture. And if I want to make this a red marble, blend with color, make that blend color red. And now I get a blend of both. And I can always go in here and delete this, and I get back to my original color-only based material. So hopefully that'll help form that connection in your workflow with texturing versus the color parameters and all of that. Another new feature in addition to opacity you'll find in the plastic. So let's take a look at this. I'm just going to go ahead and delete. So in the plastic material parameters, we have, of course, our diffuse, which is basically the underlying overall color of it, and then you have specular. And specular is just sort of the reflection color, and you can actually go in here and make it a unique color for the specular from the diffuse. Technically, if you're making trying to make a realistic plastic, specular should always be white. or some level of pure gray. So we're going to set that to white. But now the cool thing about KeyShot 3 is you can actually map your specular as well. So let's take a look. We can either expand the specular parameter here and load in a texture right here, or we can hop over to the Textures tab, and we see in the plastic material type we have a texture, a specular texture box. You can double click that. And what I'm going to bring in is just a pure black and white image, and this will show the extremes of what a specular map does. Let's bring this one in right here. So now I'm going to map this a little smaller, bring that down a little bit. All right. Now let's concentrate on this little area of highlight. Where you see it darker, it's actually saying it's not reflective at all. That's your specular map in effect. So you can see as we maneuver around here, that specular map is telling the surface to be shiny or not. And you can use images that aren't purely black and white. If I bring in something like this, you can see some areas are slightly less shiny than others. So you can create some really cool effects, especially if you combine your color texture, your bump texture, all these things together to make some very advanced materials. And then, of course, on top of all of that, you have your labels system. And this basically works the same as KeyShot 2. You apply a label, and you can position it. There hasn't been too much added to that. We've just tried to revamp the functionality here. You know, if we load in a couple labels, one of the nice things, you can actually add new labels, you know, and you get this little tree to show you what labels are used, and at the highest in the tree will be at the will actually show on top of others, and you can reposition those, delete them, all that kind of stuff. So just some basic workflow enhancements going on there. All right, I'm going to override that material back with the platinum, and there we are. Nice looking material. Okay. So those are some of the basic material updates, and we can now take a look at how we can increase the usability of parts. You know, we can go in and actually move individual parts now, and that's the main update here. So let's say I want to just move this diamond. I can right-click on it and move just that individual part. I can rotate it. And the sensitivity on the manipulator is needs a little tuning, but we can also right-click right here, move part, and see if we can get that rotating a little better. There we are. All right. So you can see you can move this, rotate it, and of course scale it, and we can always reset back to the original position. So you can use this to form scenes from one single model. You don't have to actually bring in individual models in order to gain that sort of control. You can also go into the tree here, and you can see we actually are retaining the entire tree structure of these different groups. So I can take an entire structure, an entire branch of the tree, and move that. So I can bring all these diamonds up, away from the rest of the model. And of course, this will be part of the KeyShot 3 without animation. So if you want to create still images of exploded views, you can do that by maneuvering individual parts into sort of an exploded position. Now you can also, of course, duplicate and then move the entire model. So we'll just bring this over here. And so you can create some nice scenes that way. All right, so let's take a look at, I'm going to go back to a basic file here, and we'll take a look at animation. So we'll import, bring in the BIP. We're going to import this file. Okay, open up the library, and just grab a platinum here and apply that there and there. And we can apply a diamond material here. Gem. There we are. And we'll just bring that IOR up and add a little Abby number for the dispersion effect. There we go. In a softer environment. Great. So now to animate this, we have the basic way to do it is to go into the timeline, and you can click Animation Wizard, and then this should lead you through. So you can do any of these animation types. You can also do camera animation. We'll cover that in a second. But what I want to do here is I'm actually going to pull each one of these diamonds out from the ring. So what I want to do is a translation animation. Go to the next step here. I'm going to select one of these diamonds. So it could be this one, and you can see I get feedback in terms of an outline. So we can start with that and go to the next step. And this is where you actually adjust the parameters of the animation. So you can see this isn't quite rotating on the, or moving on the correct axis, so I want to try changing some of these parameters. One trick here, while this is playing back animation, I'm going to extend the time so it'll play a little bit slower so you can see without as much lag. One trick here is to go into performance mode. So that's Alt-P, and that basically cuts down ray bounces, turns off things like detailed indirect illumination, detailed shadows, all those things, and makes everything just work a bit faster. So now I can go in here and tune these settings. So you can see this real-time feedback of what happens as you move these sliders. And I can also take my timeline, just put it to the end, so I can kind of see the end result. So I don't want this translate on Y actually at all, so I'm going to just put in 0 there. Let's see if Z, or X rather, is what we want. And that's actually not what we want as well. So let's go to the Z axis. And of course, if you modeled your model, you should have a good idea of which axes were from the actual modeling software, and that's exactly what this is using. This knew from Rhino that this diamond was positioned with its Z-axis, its original Z-axis, pointing this way. And each one of these diamonds was positioned with that same axis pointing relative to each individual diamond. So for each one, there's a Z-axis pointing sort of directly away from almost the center of the ring. And that's because the diamond was modeled with the Z up, and it retains that. And that is going to be retained when you're in axis orientation local mode. So if we change that to global mode, Z now is a global Z, and you can see what the global axis looks like by going to View and going to Show Coordinate Legend. And now you can see how that is actually corresponding to this global origin legend. If we translate on the Y as well, you can see that's now going up. So let's just go to 1 on the Z, 0 on the Y, 0 on the X, and go to local. And so there we are. Now I'm going to make this just about maybe 2 seconds long, and I can also type in those things here. And let's just play this back. Now I know this is going to be a bit laggy over the meeting, but it should look better on the recording if you want to revisit this later. Okay, now one of the nice features here is motion ease. What this does is basically accelerates and decelerates in and out of the animation. So as the movement starts, it'll accelerate out, and as it comes to a stop, it'll slow down gradually. If we set this motion ease to linear, it will use one speed for the entire duration of this animation, which is sometimes what you want if you want things to to work in a very linear way. But for most things, you want to actually ease in and ease out so that you get a nice, smooth, natural movement. So that's basically my settings. I'm going to call this gem translate 1. Why not? All right, finish that. And now we have this one chunk of animation. If we go over into our project window and go to the scene tree, double click on my gem translate 1 animation, you can see that's applied to this first diamond. Now what I want to do is basically replicate that animation onto the rest of the diamonds along the band. And so what I want to do is copy and paste. Copy the animation, paste it here, and here, and here, and here. So that's one side. And as you can see, let me just pause here. The nice thing about this is, like I said, because of the local origin, or the local axes rather, these are all moving in their own independent little spaces along their own z-axes. And I can go in here and now offset these to create a more interesting animation. So if I want the first, if I want this first diamond with translate 1 to come out first, then I can leave that at the beginning of time here, and then move each one of these animations maybe up half a second each. So this one will be at 2 seconds. Or something about like that. Now when we play that back, they come out staggered. Now I can also continue to copy and paste these animations to my other diamonds. So if I want the bottom one here to start, just paste, 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 and paste. There we are. And again, I can stagger these. So I might want my first one to be at the beginning, and then we can just take these individual ones and move them out. All right. Or we could actually switch that so that we get sort of a symmetrical movement here. Something about like that. Or actually, it was better before, but I'll leave it like this. All right, let's now take a look at this top diamond here. I might just want to add the same type of animation to that as well. So of course I can copy and paste them, or I can go just to that single diamond. Let me pause this here. Go to my gem diamond. I can of course again select here to find that part, right click, and now instead of using the wizard, I can click here and I can use this wizard to go through this again, but I can also just click here and right click, add animation, or go up here, add animation. So I'm going to right click on the part that I want to animate and add a new translation to that. And this translation we can rename, so let's call this Big Stone. And now I know my z-axis is what I want, so I'm just going to bring that up on the z. If I go to an endpoint here, I can see the result in real time as I move that. All right, so there's a nice basic movement. Maybe I'll bring this over in time. And as you can see, I can just drag these time chunks around and really compose my movement in a nice way. Maybe I'll overlap this a little bit or stretch out the time. And now in addition to this, I'm not limited to just one translation per part. I can go in here to this big diamond, and maybe I want it to rotate while it's coming out of the ring. So I can add a rotation animation. Let's see what that does. Here, I'll just put it to the end of time here so we can concentrate on just its effect. You can see it's just a simple 90-degree rotation. So I could do 90 degrees on the X, or I could do it on the Z. And if I do it on the Z, I get just spinning around its own little axis there. So this might just help add some flicker to the overall animation, some more interest instead of having things just moving completely still. Having it rotate a bit might be interesting. But now it's still only doing 90 degrees. Maybe I want this to do 360 degrees. Well, I can take my dial and move this up to 360. I can also type in 360. But one of the cool little tricks here that isn't obvious is if it's at 90 degrees, I can actually do little expressions, do a times 4, and that gives me 360. And now I get that full rotation. I just stretch out this time a little bit so it sort of matches up to my translate, and there's my basic animation. So let's try something here. I'm going to go out of performance mode, and I'm going to turn off my coordinate legend. And what I can do is actually a preview animation. to see this playing in a little bit more real time. I can always play this back right here in KeyShot, but especially if your computer isn't all that powerful, this might be a little slow when in full quality mode. And of course, Alt-P for performance mode will help with that. But if you want to spend a few moments to actually render this out in a very basic form, you can see it playing back at full speed. So you click Preview, and it will basically go in and just render each frame and then give you a video of your animation. So let's just let that render, and I'll take a look at questions. Any questions? Do you have one you want to draw attention to specifically?
Somebody asked about interactive texture mapping.
Okay.
So,
oh, that's right, during the hiccup. That's actually what I was about to get into. So I'll show the texture mapping. We'll jump back to texturing. But let's see here, almost done with our preview. And that's, of course, Brian Townsend on the questions today. So there you go, your basic animation done very quick, very easy, KeyShot style. And you can actually, a lot of the times all you need is this video right here. This is good enough for your sales meeting or whatever it is that you're doing. Go to File, Save Video. That'll give you a video file that you can use just like any regular video. All right. So before we go on with some camera animation and that kind of stuff, let's jump back over to interactive texture mapping, which is what I was going to cover when we had a little bit of a technical problem. So let's take a look at, if we do an opacity map on here again, just my circular mesh. I'm going to set that again to color. That's going to tell black to be transparent. I'm going to set it to box map, and there we go. So now I can use my mapping tool, and as I move my mapping tool, you can see it actually is moving that texture on the surface. So I can use this, instead of having to go in with my Shift, X, and Y, I can just interactively do it right here. I can also use the rotate. There might be something with a little more grain. Let's load something in here like this. All right, so now mapping tool, rotate. So you can see the rotation there allows me to really position that. Well, then, of course, there's also the scale. So I can bring this up or down in scale. And we can continue to just adjust this. And that's basically your mapping tool. This mapping tool will work with all of your different mapping types. So if you can interactively map your spherical map as well. You just load that, scale, and you can really position that. Now, one of the main things this solves from KeyShot 2 is the idea of the cylindrical mapping. A lot of times you'll bring in something that needs a cylindrical map, but you'll find the default cylindrical mapping in KeyShot isn't actually oriented correctly. It's actually sort of perpendicular to what you would want your cylindrical map to be. So by going to the cylindrical map and then using the mapping tool, you'll be able to rotate your cylinder so that it matches up to the shape of your model. All right, let's just put this material back on here, and we'll go back to animation a little bit. All right, so now you have your cameras right here in your scene tree, and then you also, of course, have your camera tab where you can go in between these different cameras. But what we're going to do is go to the scene tree, and we can animate any one of these cameras that's already saved here. So if I go to front camera, I can add animations to this, or I can take my camera, position it. Maybe I want my starting point to be about here. I can add my camera right here, or I can go to my camera tab, click Save here, and that gives me a camera that I can, of course, rename. But I'll just leave this at camera 9, make sure that's active. You can see right-click, Set as Active, gives you your camera. So we're going to go to camera 9, and now I'm going to add animation. The most basic animation type is just a simple orbit. So we'll go to Add Camera Animation, Orbit, or we can go to the timeline again, go to the Animation Wizard, And instead of doing a model or part animation, we'll do a camera animation. You can see the types of animations these are right here in the little preview. And let's start with just a simple orbit. So an orbit's going to just spin the camera around its look-at point, basically, 360 degrees by default. So we're going to add this to camera 9, go next, and it automatically starts playing for you, and you can start to compose this animation here right in the timeline. So if I just, here, we'll put it over here, you can see we're just rotating around this model. I'll drag and drop a real-life environment here. We'll put it in the classic Lexion conference room. I'm going to bring back the environment as my background. So now you can see this is different than a turntable in that it is the camera that's moving. It is not the model rotating within the camera's view, but rather the camera itself moving around the model. All right, let's put in just a simple environment here. Oops. Do white background. Okay, so we can continue to tune these settings before we save out the final camera animation, but we can also always go back and edit. So, you can choose your motion ease. You'll see with camera orbit, motion ease defaults to linear, and the idea there is that a lot of times what you're doing with this kind of movement is actually creating a loopable animation. And so by having a linear motion ease on a camera orbit animation, the animation will come back to the exact same starting point. Of course, with this animation, I have these stones not coming back to the same starting point, so that's something else I could do by adding some more animations. But the camera animation doesn't accelerate and decelerate at the ends, so it just smoothly will replay or loop as the video plays. But we'll just click Finish, and now we can add some other animations here. So let's say I want my animation to zoom in on the ring while it's animating. Well, we can right-click, or we can go through the wizard. But in this case, let's just right-click on the camera, go to Add Camera Animation, or we can go up here, Add Camera Animation. And what I'm going to do is add a zoom. And now what we're doing is, as we go through the time here, we're actually zooming in very slightly by default. So let's add some distance to this. You can get really in there. And that just smoothly zooms while rotating around the model. So you can create some cool effects. You could go the other way with it. I could go in here. Let's take my camera this time and actually move. We'll just go to the beginning point here. Let's put the camera right in there. It starts very obscure. I'm going to save a new camera. This is going to allow me to set up a completely different camera animation system right here in the same. So I don't even these other camera animations aren't really being used now. So I have my camera 10 and I have a zoom animation. So I'm just going to, let's see here. I'm going to actually do one little thing here. I'm going to go back to the free camera and I'm just going to save a new camera here. So going to for my free camera, go to camera here and save yet another new camera. All right, so there's my camera 11. Nice and fresh. It's not a duplicate of camera 9, which is what camera 9 became. And I'll warn that some things here are a little rough still. Of course, this isn't the final release version. But basically what I've done is I have a new camera at this starting position. So this time I'm going to zoom out from this position. So instead of using a positive, we'll just use a negative. And let's go to the end point. Because you'll see, of course, if you leave the time indicator at the beginning, you won't really see any effect from your animation. So we'll go to the end point here. Let's do -8 on the distance for this zoom. Let's see what that looks like as we come out from the center of that. All right, there we go. And now I could add, of course, another orbit. So let's just do that. 360 degrees. So now we're spinning around the model as we zoom out. And maybe this final framing isn't quite what I want. Maybe I want this to be a little higher in the frame. So one of the things I can add is a translation to my camera. And you can see that actually goes the wrong way in this case by default, which is a translate on the Y. And you can see these animations being used here. So I want, make this smaller, bring that up here, make this smaller, zoom down. All right. So we have this translation. I'm going to stretch its time out a little bit as well. And now I'm ending here, which isn't quite what I want. So I'm going to take my translate Y and move it the other way. So let's compare this now. So now we zoom out and we end up with a nicer framing of the final image. If I turn that off, you can see the difference. Turn that back on, we get a nice framing there. Now another thing I can do to continue to just combining these animations, can actually add an inclination animation as well. Now this is actually rotating the camera vertically up and down, and you can see by default it's 45 degrees, and you can see the result that has there. So I probably want a little more subtle than that, maybe even go negative. So I'm going to end with a lower view of my ring than when I started. So let's see what that looks like. All right. So a pretty cool result. We can play that back. We can go into performance mode. And of course I could always render out a preview animation. So now that we've animated this and I want to actually output it, what I want to do is just make sure everything looks right by going out of performance mode. And now performance mode can also be accessed not with just the Alt-P hotkey, but also here in the Settings tab. I can drag my quality presets between quality and fast. Fast is performance mode. Now also in quality mode, we can go in here and add ray bounces. Especially when I'm working with diamonds, it's nice to be able to find the number of ray bounces that I need right here in real time before I go and do my final render. Of course, too few ray bounces leads to blackness in these diamonds. All right, there we are. So now that I have basically my whole scene tuned, my animation is all done, I want to go to render. And I have a couple of options. Of course, by default I'm in still image, and I can just render out exactly the frame I'm looking at right here. But I want to render out an animation, go to animation mode, and now I have the option of a video output as well as individual frame output. So if you're a person that might go into After Effects and and edit together a whole movie, well, then you're probably going to want your frames, because that'll allow you to import that frame sequence into After Effects or whatever video editing software and manipulate them at completely full quality rather than working with a compressed video file. You can also do an uncompressed AVI file, which will give you more or less the same quality as the frame output. And then you can choose to render out your entire duration, or you can actually set what we call a work area here in the timeline and render out just a small segment of your animation. So, and once you have a work area, if you want to render that out, enable work area mode, and you can see that's rendering out far fewer frames. Or you can input a frame range specifically without having to do it here in the timeline itself. So once you get your formats and your resolution and all that set, you can then look at the quality tab, and in the quality tab you have three basic options for how you'll output it. You have first the advanced control, which is basically the traditional way KeyShot has always rendered, which is it'll res up and you'll see the individual blocks and they'll populate out from the center. Now, that's a good option a lot of the time, but maybe one of the best options for animation, that's actually to use the maximum samples mode here. And those of you familiar with KeyShot 2 real-time mode render output method, that's basically what this uses. And what it does is each frame of the animation will be rendered to the exact same quality. So each single frame will be given what we call samples. It will be given whatever you set here, that many samples. And that's basically how many times that individual frame is refreshed and made better. It's a similar process to what you see in real time here, in that you get, you start out very rough looking like this, and as you let it sit, what's happening is this image is being sampled, 1 times, 2 times, 32 times, and as you increase the samples, it gets better. And by setting samples per frame, you're guaranteed to have the exact same quality on every frame. Now your last option here is maximum time. You can set in per frame, I want each frame to render for a minute, or I want 2 minutes, or I want just render over 5 hours total, or render only, maybe I want only 5 minutes. You can do that as well. And this is a similar rendering process to the maximum frames option, but some of the frames will render for 11 seconds, may look slightly different than a more complicated frame that rendered for 11 seconds and didn't quite get to the same level of quality as a simpler frame. So with animation, we would actually suggest trying to use the samples option to make sure everything is perfectly consistent. But you can explore which one works best. They all should work great, of course. So then, go ahead and click render. It'll output all the frames and give you a video file. And that's basically your animation system in KeyShot. There's some things left to be implemented that you'll see before the final release, and some tune-ups here and there. And also you'll discover nice little updates throughout the UI. Things like, you may have noticed the backplate tab is completely gone. Now you just have a background category under the environment tab, and you can choose, do I want my lighting environment, or a color background, or a backplate? And I can just load that backplate right in. So you can see some really nice new features here, just a general cleanup of the entire software. All right, so I'll take a look at some questions, and then we'll wrap this thing up. All righty. All right, so one question, something we get commonly is, what kind of system do you need to really make KeyShot work, fast and reliably? Well, the nice thing about KeyShot is, of course, it is CPU based entirely, and the nice thing about CPUs is you don't have to worry about always updating to the latest. There's not a new CPU every 2 months like there are graphics cards. Instead, you have a nice standardized Intel or AMD CPU that will last you years, and you don't have to worry about drivers for your CPU and all that kind of stuff. And KeyShot really does work on anything from a dual core system all the way up to 24 cores, and it really scales nicely. And on those dual core systems, of course, it'll be slower, but it's never unbearably slow. And we also give you things like Alt-P for performance mode to speed up any system. And this really will make it work on any system. Animation for textures. This is not something we're implementing in the first version. Of course, you can animate models with textures on them, but actually moving textures on a model and animating that isn't going to be in the first version of KeyShot, but it's a system that we can expand into animating all sorts of things in the future. Will there be a limit on the size of the video? There most certainly will not. There will be, sort of like we have now with KeyShot, how you have Pro and Standard. There will be some difference in the way output is dealt with based on your license, but you'll be able to get your HD video most certainly with the Pro version plus animation. But that's also something that our sales team will have a more clear definition on as well. Let's see here. So output formats for animation, in addition to the individual frames, you have your AVI. So we have Flash video actually is in there, and QuickTime. So there are your formats right there. Do the option sliders in the texture mapping section allow you to input beyond the slider range? Actually, yeah, pretty much all of the sliders in KeyShot allow you to go beyond the slider range, and the texture mapping section is one of those areas. Depth of field, if you animate depth of field, or not actually animate the depth of field, but if you have a camera that has depth of field and you zoom that camera, you will get the accurate depth of field result. As you're closer in, you'll have more depth of field, and as you zoom back, your object can basically come into focus. So yes, you can work your depth of field into your animation. Okay, can you animate your camera and keep it, and it'll remain independent of object animation? Absolutely. All of these object animations I have in the in here, I can actually turn off, just uncheck them, and I can always see, my camera animation alone. And I could completely delete these and just animate my camera. Okay, variance of a model. The way you would do variants of a given model in KeyShot is actually make duplicates of it right here in the scene tree, and each one of those duplicates you can apply unique materials to. And that is another one of those nice things about the CPU and the CPU system we have for rendering is it can handle a lot of data. So as you duplicate models, you can hide and show and render these individual models like they're variants. But you will want to just duplicate or import new variants. FBX is one thing that will be supported. You can import your FBX with animation. Right now it supports part animation, so you can animate in Maya or 3D Studio and then save that out as an FBX, bring that in, and those part animations will actually be retained and you'll be able to play them back in KeyShot here. I didn't have an FBX file to show today, but that is something we'll most certainly cover in the future as well. Another animation question.